Good morning, brothers and sisters. Hans Denk, who lived from 1495 to 1527, said these words, "The medium is Christ, whom no one can truly know unless he follows him in life, and no one may follow him unless he has first known him." On the backs of t-shirts that carry our church logo on the front is a verse from Micah 6, which states that which the Lord requires: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In the Message, Romans 8:11 reads, "It stands to reason, doesn't it, that if the alive and present God who raised Jesus from the dead moves into your life, He'll do the same thing in you that he did in Jesus, bringing you alive to himself? When God lives and breathes in you, and he does as surely as he did in Jesus, you are delivered from that dead life." We live, dear friends, in a time when it seems fear is the prevailing force that drives our thoughts and actions. The emotion of fear is very real. It is necessary, and it is overrated. Fear is the spontaneous response when we are driving and see someone coming straight at us, or when we witness our child getting hurt and must act quickly. The natural emotion of fear compels us to avert danger or to seek help fast. A dose of fear gets our adrenaline pumping in these kinds of situations, and that is a good thing. Fear is also sometimes the response felt when we are approached by a stranger who we might perceive to be dangerous, or the thing we feel when we hear newscasters portray others as evil. Fear can drive us to consider acting in ways that are not consistent with who we claim to be as followers of Christ. It compels us to believe the myths we hear that if we are stronger and more powerful, with more guns and deadlier weapons, we will be safer. There, I've named a fear I feel, and it's something to wrestle with. I admit that I feel afraid to think of someone causing harm to me or my family or friends. I am also afraid there is a part of me that could be capable of hurting another who is a threat. I admit that fear makes me reactive and irrational. And I admit that I know we are conflicted on how we feel about guns and violence, the thought of conflict, which invokes a level of fear as well. So for the sake of full disclosure, I will say this: I don't like guns. Even though I grew up in a family of hunters and fishermen, there were guns in the house for the purpose of hunting for food or getting rid of an occasional skunk that might wander into the yard. As children, we knew the guns were off limits, not to be touched. While they were visible, they were in a locked cabinet. Never, ever were they even to be considered as a weapon to be used against another human being. At least that is what I remember. Perhaps this is some of your experience as well, or maybe many of you never ever even had a gun in the house. But our world seems different now, and guns are purchased for other reasons, many of which are born out of fear. Fear that there will be a law made that prohibits people from owning guns, and fear that someone will attack and there will be a need to defend and protect. There are many and confusing statistics available, and I am not here to try to convince you one way or the other. I want rather to look at what Jesus might have to say to us, and to invite us to be courageous enough to look inside ourselves, to do some self-reflection. Hans Denk quote about knowing Jesus and following him takes some pondering. Seems a little like the chicken and egg dilemma, doesn't it? Which came first, knowing Jesus or following him? And really, how can we do one without the other? But I suggest this is a process of transformation we pilgrims embark on when we discover Jesus. He does some pretty off-the-wall things that go against what makes sense to us in a world that seemed and still seems out of control with polarization and violence. He responded to those things with words of wisdom and with healing that set things right again. He did not react to or in fear. He knew, as Paul said in Romans, that his Father lived and breathed in him, and it was God's will to set things right. Setting things right is God's way of justice. It is grounded in and acts out of compassion and mercy. The verse on our t-shirts says, "Act justly." It is a directive to act. But for it to make sense for God's way of justice, it is important to understand that God's way of justice differs from the world's way of justice. In his book, Healing the Gospel, Derek Flood writes, "Love is not in conflict with justice. Love is how justice comes about because the New Testament understanding of justice is ultimately not about punishment, but about making things right again." End quote. The criminal model of justice is punishment, while the New Testament model of justice is making things right again. Making things right happens through mercy. Mercy in the criminal model means leniency and inaction, which is in conflict with justice. But in the New Testament model, mercy is the act of making things right again, and those acts are the means to justice. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. We cannot put these words together if we only adhere to the world's understanding of justice. Some of you may recall the story of preacher Peter from several hundred years ago, who was awakened in the middle of the night by people on his roof. He went out to see what was going on and discovered some men taking his thatch roof apart. He hurried inside, quietly woke his wife, and asked her to prepare a meal. When it was ready, he went out and acknowledged to the men that they must be tired and hungry from their hard work. Would they please come in to share a meal together? They did, even though they felt pretty uncomfortable. And when they had finished eating, they proceeded back outside and up on the roof to repair all they had damaged. Or the more recent story recorded by Walter Wink in his book Engaging the Power of Angie O'Gorman, who was awakened by an intruder in her bedroom one night. She says this, "As I lay there feeling a fear and vulnerability I had never before experienced, several thoughts ran through my head, all in a matter of seconds. The first was the uselessness of screaming. The second was the fallacy of thinking safety depends on having a gun hidden under your pillow. The third thought, I believe, saved my life. I realized with a certain clarity that either he and I made it through this situation safely together, or we would both be damaged. Our safety was connected." When Angie thought about this, she could act out of a concern for both of them. She engaged him in conversation, asking him what time it was. He answered, which was a good sign, and helped the conversation to continue. They talked about the time, about some financial struggles, about how he had gotten into her house. She said they talked until they were no longer strangers, and she felt it was safe to ask him to leave. He didn't want to. He had no place to go, and she knew that she could not physically force him out. So she told him, firmly but respectfully as equal to equal, that she would give him a clean set of sheets, but he would have to make his own bed downstairs. He did. She sat up wide awake the rest of the night. But in the morning, they ate breakfast together, and he left. Each of the Gospels records Jesus' response to one of them who was with him in the garden where Jesus was arrested, who drew a sword and cut off an ear of one who came to arrest him. John identifies the person as Peter, and Luke says that Jesus healed the one whose ear had been cut off. Each of these four gospel accounts makes mention of the arresting crowd being armed with clubs and swords. And Jesus responds with questions, with directives to put them away, and with healing. Put your sword back into its sheath. Put your sword back into its place, for all who live by the sword will perish by the sword. Jesus did not react out of fear, though he may well have felt very afraid, but responded still out of compassion and mercy, for that was what was in his heart where God lived and breathed. Jesus revealed the character and nature of God, but some Old Testament writers knew the character and will of God as well. The author of Psalm 33 says this, beginning with verse 13. The Lord looks down from heaven, and he sees all humankind. From where he sits enthroned, he watches all the inhabitants of the earth, he who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. A king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a vain hope for victory, and by its great might it cannot save. Truly, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and shield. Our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love be upon us, O Lord, even as we hope in you. Is it possible to prepare our hearts to respond from the center where God lives and breathes when we are afraid? I cannot imagine what it must feel like to be in a place crowded with people when someone enters with powerful guns with the intent to kill. Or to be sitting in church when someone enters with the intent to kill. Or being at school or at work or even in my own home when someone enters with the intent to harm or kill. And admittedly, I imagine fear would take over and chaos would reign, and I fear I would wonder if God really is living and breathing in me. So it's easier to sit on the outside and give my opinions. But I still hear the voice of Jesus who said, "Put your sword away. Those who live by the sword die by the sword." And I wonder if when we carry a gun to defend ourselves, we are in essence declaring that we have given up on humanity. If all opportunity for dialogue and reconciliation and healing is annihilated with the pull of a trigger. And I wonder if we are turning our back on Jesus, denying that as followers of Christ, we are commanded to love even those who would harm us. I wonder what this unhealthy kind of fear does to us inside, where God lives and breathes, and he surely does, just as he did in Jesus. What happens inside of us when we live suspect and in fear of those around us? Jesus was sure of God's presence with him. The groundwork had been done, the foundation laid that God's love is steadfast and can be trusted. He could hear God's voice and carry on without fear. Certainly did not mean there would be no danger. In fact, danger lurked everywhere Jesus went. But his heart was centered in God, and he lived from that center. It is where we are to live as well. To live from this center requires looking deeply into ourselves with honesty and finding out who we are, who God calls us to be. It is recognizing that we are wounded and in need of healing. It is acknowledging that we must face our own inclination to retaliate and work at God's justice, which is setting things right again rather than retribution. It is learning to see Christ in all others with the eyes of Christ who is in us. It is living authentically, which means knowing and acting according to the beliefs and values you choose, rather than by the beliefs and values of others or the surrounding culture. It is seeing in others the light of God that no darkness has been able to overcome. Facing what is inside me requires seeing the light of God in me, and that is true for each of us. It is believing that Jesus is the center from which my thoughts and actions emerge. It is believing and accepting God's love for me and for all others. When fear is at the center, I am living from a false self that listens to the voices around me rather than to the voice of God that is within. And to hear God's voice, we have to be still and listen. Be still and know that I am God, the psalmist writes. All may be in turmoil around us, but Christ, who comes from God, is at the center, living and breathing in us. Listen to him. Close your eyes and hear God's word to you.